So early, before we started the show today, we talked about different themes. And one of the themes we talked about that would be fun to highlight would be resilience.
Yes.
And so I think that's a perfect bridge. So what are some maybe resilient moments in your life, part of your origin story, that you think really equipped you to be able to navigate all the different, seemingly disparate roles you've had in your career, but actually they all kind of connected. But there had to be some level of resilience for you to be able to navigate those waters.
Yes.
So I would love to hear you talk about the power of resilience as a leader and maybe some elements in your own story that helped you develop that.
So very early on, I didn't even think about the word resilience. I think it wasn't until later in my corporate America space that then the word kind of got attached to me. But I grew up in an all-American family. My father was in the Air Force. My mother was in community service. And for all intent purposes, they thought I would be something very successful like the mayor. But that all changed at the age of 14 when I dropped out of school in 9th grade. And so I'm a high school dropout, and that's because I had my first child at the age of 14 in 9th grade.
Tiffany, I'm so excited to have you on the show today.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor.
Yeah, it's really, really exciting because you and I have had some history of just knowing each other as you were getting your MBA.
Yes.
And now you've done so many more even exciting things beyond that. So for the Leadership Foundry show, always what we do here is we spotlight a leader's journey and what not only got her to the place that she's at, but some of the highlights and learnings along the way. So maybe a good starting place for listeners that aren't familiar with you, start with kind of what's your role today, and then let's go all the way back in time and then tell us the journey that got you here.
Yeah, all the way back in time. So my role today, I serve as Vice President and Head of Investor Relations for Starbucks, which a company most people hopefully have heard of.
I would be surprised if someone hadn't heard of Starbucks at this point in the game.
Yes, we're almost like a household name. That's a good thing. But my journey before being at Starbucks, I actually started in Big Four. So I'm a CPA by background. And I did about 7.5, 8 years in Big Four at PwC and Ernst & Young. And that's where I really started to see a diverse slate of clients and industries, and it really excited me. And so after doing Big Four for 7.5, 8 years, I then moved over to industry at Time Warner and spent half of my time in the internal audit function and the other half in consulting.
Oh, interesting. So you were doing internal audit, but then also consulting.
I did. So it was all with Time Warner, and so they had an internal consulting group. And so spent half of my time in audit, and then I was asked to go over to the consulting group. And it was actually initially just a one-year project where I was supposed to help set up a center of excellence for the accounting function. And that 1 year turned into 5 years in consulting. And so after I spent about 10 years in total at Time Warner, I migrated over to the fintech space, still in internal audit, and it was at Fiserv. And so did a really good job at Fiserv, and there was so much opportunity, and the company was so great at career development that from internal audit, I then did strategy and operations for the CFO, and ultimately was tapped to head investor relations. And so did that role, and in doing that role, oversaw a number of mergers and acquisitions, including our acquisition of First Data. And after that restructuring, I moved over to a company called Ingredion. They're a supplier for Starbucks, and stayed there as head of investor relations and corporate communications officer. And then Starbucks called. And I say, when Starbucks calls, you answer. And so from there, the rest is history, at least for now.
Yeah, that's really, really exciting. Okay, so I want to hone in on a couple pieces here.
Yes.
So you started off in kind of accounting, audit, and then you pivoted into consulting. Is that a common transition, or was there something around that was a little bit unique in your journey?
It's not common at all.
Okay.
And I always tell people, being in kind of the CPA accounting arena, you are almost trained to think black and white, especially as an auditor, if you will.
Yeah.
And being in consulting, you have to be able to navigate through gray and navigate through ambiguity. And so usually the two are not in one person's career profile. But what happened for me was I did, such a good job in being in the audit function, but also being a partner. So not necessarily being corporate police, but really building relationships. And that's how then I got tapped on the shoulder to have interest in going into consulting. And so it was more of, hey, not only do you know this space as we set up this shared service, but you know controls, you know kind of risk management, but you're also really good at building relationships. And so that's how that opportunity came to me to go into that group for 1 year.
Yeah, so that's because now that you say it, it makes total sense to me. Auditing is kind of a retrospective. You're looking back
Yes.
on time. Okay, let's make sure everything's where it should be, and that's an important function. And the consulting is more forward-looking.
Yes.
That's what's possible. Where can we go? Which is kind of two different mindsets.
Exactly.
But I love that the pivot, why people really saw you being able to make that move, was your relationship building skills, your
Yes.
ability to partner and advise and influence.
So it really wasn't about the technical skills at that point. It was all about the soft skills. And that's what was portable.
Okay, so then we're in
Yes.
consulting and we're doing some of this for a while, and then all of a sudden someone taps you and says, hey, investor relations would be interesting. I would imagine that's not a common transition.
Yeah, yeah.
So what was it in your background or in your persona, or maybe your passion and interest,
Yeah.
which made that kind of door open?
Yeah, so I didn't have it on my radar. So the link between the two, so we met at our time at Emory University. When I went on to Fiserv, I then left the company and went to Wharton. And so in graduating from Wharton, I came back to Fiserv. So I moved to Philadelphia, came back to Atlanta, and I had a conversation with my CFO at the time. And I had said, hey, I'm back and I want to do more. And he was saying, Tiffany, you just got back, like get settled in. Well, then a week later, he called and said, hey, you said you wanted to do more. How about heading up investor relations? And so I didn't even have it on my radar. And I remember clearly saying, can I think about it? And he said, sure, I'll hold. And it was that quick that I got into investor relations. And so I think the idea behind investor relations at that time was you're mixing finance with communications. And so I had the finance background. I was previously Miss Black Georgia USA. And so I spent a year reigning for the state and representing the state. So that was the communications training. And so in essence, it was marrying those two. And who would have ever thought that that experience would parlay into a corporate America job? And so I think part of it also was my reputation of, if you give it to her, she'll figure it out. And so that's how I ended up in investor relations. It was just by luck and from someone trusting me and from me raising my hand and constantly saying, I want to do more.
So, and what I'm hearing in this is, yeah, luck for sure, but definitely like a unique combination of skills, which probably a lot of folks didn't have.
Yeah.
Like Miss Georgia, and then you've got this auditing and accounting background, which is interesting. Then you've got this relationship building and advising and consulting background. I mean, this whole kind of collection of things kind of set up this perfect role for you.
Yeah, I always say I'm a true corporate athlete. A true corporate athlete versus a kind of subject matter expert.
So often I think when people envision their career path, there's the big bucket functions, right? There's marketing, there's
Yes.
operations, there's finance, there can be accounting, there can be HR, sales. Investor relations isn't typically considered one of those big bucket functions.
No.
It's a critical function, but not one of those big bucket functions. So what makes a really good investor relations executive? What are the kind of the things that you think, as you've kind of not only navigated your career,
Yes.
but seen other people who are really good at it? What are those either background pieces or secret tools or gifts they have?
Yeah, so I think it's definitely a kind of melting pot of a number of different skill sets and abilities. So one, it's finance, right? I tell people, some people speak Spanish, some people speak French, I speak numbers. And so that's one skill set for investor relations. The other piece is communications, because you're really communicating the story and the storyline of a company out to Wall Street. Another piece that's very important is that relationship building, because you have to build those relationships with all the investors, the analysts. The majority of my day, I'm on the phone with Wall Street, and so building those relationships are critical. But the other piece is also executive presence and being able to almost be that strategic advisor and chief of staff for your CFO and your CEO. So many times I'm sitting in the room with those individuals, and I'm hearing not only what's happening with the company, but it's my job to bring the voice of the investor into that room, into that conversation. So having that confidence and being able to have that presence to sit in the boardroom and advise them is also very important.
Okay, so let's go back to your first role. Eventually we're going to get to Starbucks, which is super cool, but I want to go back to your first role of investor relations.
Yes.
What were maybe highlight of a learning or two that you had that was like an aha moment that maybe shaped how you viewed yourself as a leader or viewed that role?
Yeah, I think one of the big aha moments when I first joined investor relations was how much weight is placed on any and everything that comes out of my mouth.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. But I can
Yes.
see you walking into that role not realizing that anything that you say.
Right? And so it's not only the words that you're saying it, but even the tone and the demeanor. And so if someone's asking a question about, we heard A, B, and C on the call, can you tell us more about that? Will that trend continue? Is this something that we should start to factor into our model? The way that you describe it, the way that you explain it, whether you're very enthusiastic or whether you're calm, will be interpreted and included in their analysis. And so that was a big aha moment for me, was the power and the weight of what I say and how I say it, and the consequences that it could have for a company. And so that's a skill set that you can't necessarily be taught. You just have to learn it, and then you have to be extremely aware of it.
So is that something that you plan and prepare for when you're getting ready to have some kind of a communication? Or is it something that comes a little natural to you, or a little bit of both?
It's definitely both.
Okay.
Because it's a mindset, right? So it's almost like you're always on. And so you have to just remember to always be on. But it's also preparation as you're going through, making sure that you understand the storyline of a company and the marketing behind the story and what we want to highlight and what we want to emphasize. Understanding the power of tone and tenor really helps with executing that role.
Okay. So this is your third investor relations role,
Yes,
is that right?
Yes. Third and biggest.
And biggest. So, all right, I was about to ask you about that. I could already talk about that, how we say things. You were like, and biggest.
Yes.
Right? So as things have gotten bigger in terms of the scope of your role, what's different? What's the same and what's different?
Ooh, what's the same is, I think, the level of intensity that is truly placed on what we say and how we say it, as well as the interest in any and everything. Things that I would not normally think would be news is news for Starbucks, right? And it's the smallest things, but the smallest things gets picked up by mainstream media. And so then it kind of comes to me and people have the questions and the phone is ringing. And so that's the biggest thing is, wow, with such a global iconic brand, the smallest thing makes headlines.
Yeah, that's really. So I think one of the challenges for leaders, particularly when they're in executive roles like yourself, and they've got to kind of manage some of the news that's out in the world, is, and there's no right answer to this, I don't think. So this frees you up in this. Is knowing how quickly to respond, because there's such a thing as too quick.
Yeah.
Maybe we haven't really thought this through yet. We need to think it through. But then also, if you wait too long, then you're going to get dinged for waiting too long.
Yes.
Like, what took you so long to respond? They clearly don't care, or they don't have their act together.
Yeah.
So how do you navigate that challenging window?
So 2 parts that I think about when you ask kind of navigating that window. One, I think my background in audit actually helps me because I'm very thorough and I like to cross all T's and dot all I's. And so just being prepared with that information before the requests come in really helps me. So it's almost like you have this library of knowledge in your head. So as requests come in, you kind of already know the talking points and the themes. The other piece is relationship building. And so having that time to proactively build relationships well before you need them internally and externally. So that way when questions come in, I know who to go to clarify and confirm. But also building those relationships externally, because if a question comes in, I have that relationship where that investor, that analyst, or that media outlet will be patient and let me do the due diligence and get back to them.
Yeah.
And I think that really has helped because a lot of times I will get a preview of what a story will say. I'll get a preview of what an analyst note will say. And they say, hey, this is what we're going to publish. Did we capture things correctly? And that all goes back to relationship building.
Yeah. So when you think about leadership today with so much news, noise, I'm sure something else that begins with letter N, I don't know, all different things kind of going on in the world, what makes it so hard today when you think about kind of managing communication, keeping people on the same page, trying to avoid divisiveness?
No 2 days are the same, and you never know what's going to pop. And so it's almost like operating in an emergency room, right? You just never know what's walking through the door. and you have an idea that it's probably one of 100 things, but you don't know which one it'll be. And so that's the dynamic that I deal with every day, and waking up and looking at the global news, looking at the news in our industries, looking at what's happening for even our peers, because then we'll get questions if something happens with a peer in the news. They want to know, does this impact Starbucks, right? If something's happening with the economy, whether it's inflation, whether it's people looming around the layoffs in the tech industry, well, how does that impact Starbucks? So everything ties back to Starbucks, just because we're like this octopus that is impacted and kind of has tentacles in all these different areas of a consumer's lives.
So what's the role that your team plays in supporting you in that?
Yeah. So I have an awesome team, although it's not originally by design. It's an all-female IR team as well.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So we are a powerhouse, as Beyonce says, who runs the world, girls. But they help me. I have team members that they spend time doing research on our peers, and so they're able to quickly update me when I have questions. I have others that spend time kind of making sure they understand the industry of what's happening kind of with inflation and interest rates and things of that nature. And then I have others that are preparing kind of business analysis on Starbucks for me. So at any time, if I have a question about our Star Rewards or our app or our technology enablement, that they're very versed in that too. So it's really, I'm a matter of being successful because I have the team under me that is very successful, very knowledgeable, and very skilled.
I figured you would need a team in the role that you're in, because you talk about needing to be up to date on all this information.
Yes.
And then you said earlier, you're basically on calls or meetings or
yes,
interacting and building those relationships all day long. So
all day long.
When does the research come in? That wonderful team.
Yes.
So what is the thing that's most exciting about working at Starbucks?
Ooh, the most exciting thing, the culture, for sure. It is very much like a mom and pop company that just happens to be Fortune 500. And so it has a family-oriented culture feel. And, we at Starbucks, when we meet each other, when we have a new partner, because we call them partners, not employees, join the company, we always talk about people's origin stories. And that's almost like, what made you who you are? Not what's on your resume, not what school you went to, not what your major is, not the credentials on your name, behind your name, but like, what's your origin story? How'd you grow up? Who'd you grow up with? What challenges did you have? How did that shape you? And so that's so unique to Starbucks, is really just trying to understand person to person who we are. And that's that humility, that human connection that then filters through the stores.
So early, before we started the show today, we talked about different themes. And one of the themes we talked about that would be fun to highlight would be resilience.
Yes.
And so I think that's a perfect bridge. So what are some maybe resilient moments in your life, part of your origin story, that you think really equipped you to be able to navigate all the different, seemingly disparate roles you've had in your career, but actually they all kind of connected. But there had to be some level of resilience for you to be able to navigate those waters.
Yes.
So I would love to hear you talk about the power of resilience as a leader, and maybe some elements in your own story that helped you develop that.
So very early on, I didn't even think about the word resilience. I think it wasn't until later in my corporate America space that then the word kind of got attached to me. But I grew up in an all-American family. My father was in the Air Force. My mother was in community service. And for all intent purposes, they thought I would be something very successful like the mayor. But that all changed at the age of 14 when I dropped out of school in 9th grade. And so I'm a high school dropout, and that's because I had my first child at the age of 14 in 9th grade. And so I quickly found myself homeless, sleeping on couches, sleeping in shelters. And I really had to, at one point, pick myself up from my bootstraps and say, like, I am in charge of another life now. And so what am I going to do? And so I eventually went to an alternative high school, graduated high school, and went on to college, Duquesne University, Emory University, Wharton Business School, and we talked about my career journey. But the piece that really threaded through as I kind of reflect back was resilience, and having that resilience not only as a leader but as a person. And that really has shaped who I am as a leader. I show up every day trying to understand that the people on my team, first and foremost, are humans, and that they may or may not have as much resilience as I have. And so they have things going on in their life, in their personal life, that they try and leave at the door every day they walk in. And so being a leader of resilience, I just try to instill more empathy for my team and more understanding for those that may not be as resilient as I've been.
So one of the things I'm just always fascinated with is this idea of human will. Like being able to, you use the phrase, that common phrase, pull yourself up by the bootstraps.
Yes.
But there's some kind of will. There's this spark in us that says, there's more for me. There's more that I'm meant for, or I don't want to be in this situation. I want to kind of pick myself up.
Yeah.
What was that moment for you?
Yeah, I think it was really, being in a shelter and you're in a room with strangers and bunk beds and other crying children, and you realize, like, this is not for me. And so sometimes when you're at the bottom, there's actually nowhere to go but up. And so it's not a matter of a decision, it's just a matter of options. And so that's really what it was for me, and trying to say, like, I can't find myself or find my child living in this lifestyle for a very long time. And so how do I make a change and make a positive change? Okay,
so here's the billion-dollar question.
Okay.
How do you put that in other people? Where does that come from? Where does that will come from? You talked about some of your team members have varying degrees of resilience, but wouldn't it be great if we all had heightened resilience, this level of will to be able to get through some of those difficulties in life? Where did it come from for you, and how do you think we can nurture that in others?
Yeah, I think for me, where it came from was my parents, right? Even though I found myself in that situation, I had a mother who was very focused on community service, and so she always was helping children in foster care and children that were abused in the household. And so I saw that love for others through her. I have a father that was in the military, and it was all about team, right? It was all about, you got to take care of your team, and you're only as strong as your weakest link. And so I think together that parenting style of both of them really shaped me. The other piece is, I realized at some point in my life not to compartmentalize who I was. And that really came from when I was at Wharton and I was given a speech at graduation. And I was just telling about, a little bit of my origin story. And a professor afterwards had told me about his daughter and having underage drinking and how it was really taking a toll on him and his brand at the school, and how he and his wife were kind of like, we're over it, right? And he said, after I heard your story, I'm now going to go home and tell my wife we can't give up on her because she could be the next Tiffany.
Wow.
And here it is, I'm looking at this person as someone who I feel like has made it, and I'm looking at myself like I'm just little old me. But it made me realize sharing my story and sharing my resilience and sharing my challenges can sometimes help someone else identify their own resilience. And to keep that compartmentalized and keep it to myself, I'm doing others and doing my greater good a disservice.
So willing to kind of share that authentic side of yourself, that vulnerable side of yourself.
Yes.
Because for a lot of us, sharing those parts of our journey can be uncomfortable.
Very much so. Very much so.
But it really invites others to connect with us in a deeper way, I think, at least.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so, all right. So now we're going to kind of go out the crystal ball a little bit. We're going to look into the future of leadership in the next, 5 years. I think that's fair. That's a fair enough future. At least that's about as far as I can look, Tiffany. I used to think I was pretty good guessing. Now I've given up on guessing. That's why I have brilliant people like you that come on the show and help me answer these questions. So when you think 5 years out, what do you think are going to be the traits that leaders really need to be able to bring to bear to inspire, to align, to connect? To kind of keep their partners, their teams, kind of focused and excited on what's going on in such a noisy world.
Yeah. I think some of those leadership skills are going to be more the soft skills. It's going to be empathy. It's going to be understanding, right? It's going to be grace. I think if anything that was positive that came out of the pandemic, it really showed individuals maybe perhaps how burnt out they were. Perhaps how disconnected they were from the household, the family, and it allowed people to have a reset. And so I think to keep people engaged, we have to continue to respect that, continue to honor that, and show people that empathy, that grace, and that understanding that work is just one part of everyone's lives. And they have other components, and we should embrace that and allow all of that to show up at work.
I love that. I think you're so spot on. And I think the challenge with that is there's still so much push, unfairly, for everybody to move fast.
Yeah.
Everything feels urgent all the time.
Yeah.
And so in that, if we get if we default to that, there's no room for empathy, compassion, or grace.
Correct.
It's like, suck it up, keep going. And that's where burnout happens. And yet, while we want to give people empathy, compassion, and grace, if we slow down too much, then we're not. We've
lost our competitive mode. Everyone else is moving.
Exactly. So there's a weird balance. Hard. But I guess that's what makes leadership.
But I feel like there is a give and take, because I actually find receiving that empathy, that understanding from my leaders, I give 150%. Right? Because to whom much is given, much is expected. And so I think it is a little bit of a give and take, because if you give it, you're going to get that back tenfold.
Yeah. That's some very inspiring words. I love that. So I ask all my guests this question at the end of kind of our time on the Leadership Foundry podcast. What's one practical tip that you could give to leaders that will help them be better leaders starting tomorrow?
Oh, practical tip. It has to be own your narrative.
Okay.
Yeah, own your narrative, right? Own who you are, own what shapes you, own your origin story, and, really set out for your own goals and your desires and go for it. But then as you go for it, share that with others, right? It's all about, as, NABA says, lifting as you climb. And so own your story as you're doing that.
So, I love that. The argument that I hear against that, which I do not agree with, by the way, that leaders will say, is I don't want to talk about myself. No one wants to hear me talk about myself.
Yeah.
It feels self-serving or feels narcissistic. What would be your reaction or response to that?
Yeah, I don't think it's the what, it's the how, right? It's not what you're saying, it's how you're saying it. When I had first joined Starbucks, Kevin Johnson was the CEO, and great leader from Microsoft that came over to Starbucks as COO and then eventually CEO. And I was asking him, what do I need to do to be successful? And in my interview, I said, Kevin, I want to sit in your seat one day. What advice would you give me? And he said, own who you are and show up every day and show it. He said, your resume gets you here, but who you are as a person and sharing it is what's going to keep you here. And so I really think it's about not boosting and boasting and having an ego talking about yourself. It's really just the rationale and why you're sharing. So for me, I show up every day and I own my narrative and I share who I am because I want to inspire someone else. And you never know what someone else is going through. And so sometimes it's sharing your story that actually helps them, but you would never know because they're keeping it compartmentalized.
Yeah. Tiffany, thank you for all the gifts you brought today. Thank you for all the gifts you continue to bring to the world. I really, really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.